Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi warns Tel Aviv against taking any action in response to its weekend missile and drone attacks on Israel. Tehran says it can unleash a far greater force if Israel violates its territory and national interests. And for more on Middle East tensions, we have Dr. H.A. Hellyer with us in the studio. He's a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies. Let's catch up with everything that has happened so far in this bulletin. So we heard Ebrahim Raisi, so the Iranian president, coming out to warn Israel against retaliating to weekend attacks, suggesting that Iran could go further. It just chose not to. And our Israeli correspondent telling us Israel will react. It will be strategic. It will be painful. It's just a case of when. Given all this, given that we've had pressure from Israel's close partners in the West, what does this say about how Israel makes up its mind on matters like responding to an Iranian attack?
So first, thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to be here. I think there are really two factors that are going to decide how Israel responds to the Iranian retaliation that we saw a few days ago. The first is very domestic. I think Benjamin Netanyahu is in a very precarious position when it comes to internal politics in Israel. He's absurdly unpopular. His policies are not necessarily unpopular, at least with regards to the bombardment of Gaza and the continuation of the campaign there. But he personally is very unpopular and is facing tremendous opposition within the country. So I think that that's going to play a great role in terms of what sort of action he takes next with regards to Iran. How is it going to play domestically in terms of his support? How can he parlay that into extending his rule even longer? So that's factor number one. Factor number two is about the United States, which I think is pretty overwhelming, actually, when it comes to Israeli policy on a number of issues, not least of which has to do with Gaza, the Palestinians, the continuation of the occupation, the siege, and so on. But when it comes to Iran, I think he's thinking very carefully about, okay, the Biden administration has made it very clear that they will not join us in an offensive action against Iran. Now, I happen to believe that that would be the case, that they would not join in an immediate offensive action. And I don't think that Benjamin Netanyahu would have a different assessment. On the other hand, the question then becomes, all right, then if we get past that offensive, that first round of tit for tat, is the United States really going to stay out of it? And I think that that's the question that is probably being asked by the Israelis right now amongst themselves. How far would we have to get on our own before we would assume that the Americans would jump in? And I think that the Americans would eventually jump in. It's just a question of when. And it'd be those sorts of calculations that will be considered by Netanyahu at present.
Now, one criticism so far from some parties on Israel, suggesting that Washington could perhaps put greater pressure on a country for which it is a key backer. It offers weapons, financial aid, it assisted at the United Nations. How much leverage does Washington have, and do you think it's using all? Give us an number. What percentage of that leverage is it actually using on Israel?
So the criticism has a great deal of legs, in my opinion. It's not a baseless criticism. The United States is not simply a backer of Israel internationally. The United States has tremendous leverage over Israel, particularly when it comes to the relationship on arms, military support. That's not even in question. I think everybody recognizes that and realizes
President
that.
Biden telling Prime Minister Netanyahu,
yeah, so there's a difference between
win,
telling.
Take a win.
Sure.
That's clear enough.
That's clear rhetoric. And I think that that's the key issue here. The Biden administration has increased its rhetoric vis-a-vis the Israelis progressively over the past couple of months or so. But it's rhetoric. It's not the leverage. The leverage at the United Nations has not been used. The leverage in terms of the supply of arms has not been used. And just the hint of the consideration that such leverage might be used was enough to ensure that Netanyahu accepted that more humanitarian aid got in.
So this is after the deaths of the aid workers, and Biden made a 30-minute call in which he gently hinted.
Well, I don't think it was so gently. But this is the point, right? When leverage is actually used, it goes beyond rhetoric. And I think that this is the key difference here. And, you know, there will be those who say, oh, well, they can't do that. They're allies and so on. Well, that's not true. You have quite a few examples in American history, not least of which is the Reagan administration in the 80s, where, no, they were told very, very clearly, if you don't do this, then we are going to, or you don't change your behavior, we're going to hold back weapons. And it worked.
Well, a final question here. Now, October 7th, what happened then was a very clear sign that the status quo in Gaza was not sustainable. At the very same time, 6 months on, we also see how very difficult it would be to actually change the problems that created that status quo. And a very big part of that is the two-state solution. The Biden administration, Antony Blinken repeating increasingly their commitment to the two-state solution. How much leverage have they got? How committed are they to make Israel make the two-state solution part of their approach to managing affairs in the region?
So here's the reality, and I think it's a very uncomfortable reality for people to admit. Israeli society has been shifting further and further and further to the far right over the past 20 years. So the far right is now completely mainstreamed. It is not marginalized, but the risk is that it's becoming even more the center. Now, given that, it's very unlikely that you see a political spectrum of this nature giving rise to a leadership that will voluntarily withdraw from the occupied territories, recognize a Palestinian state. So voluntary is going to be off the table. The United States, if it's serious about ending this conflict in a way that even remotely looks like the upholding of a rules-based order, is going to need to use its leverage very seriously to ensure that the Israelis hold to a rules-based order. And let's be clear, rules-based order means the withdrawal of Israeli forces from
Which
Gaza.
Which is, in fact, very quickly separate from the two-state solution.
It precedes the two-state solution, as in that has to happen in order for a two-state solution to actually be put into effect. But it means that the United States has to recognize that's the sort of Israel that you're going to be dealing with. That's the sort of leverage that you must use if you're serious about a rules-based order. And if they're not, there's huge consequences, not simply for there, but I think internationally and for all of us.
And thanks for coming in and sharing those thoughts with us. Dr. H.A. Hellyer from the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies.
Thank you very much.